This is Duke University.
I want to welcome everyone to our 2017 Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture, Challenges to Our National Security and Democracy with Congressman Adam Schiff. I'm Bruce Jentleson, professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy and the Political Science Department here at Duke. The event tonight is sponsored by the Sanford School of Public Policy with support from the William R. Keenan Charitable Trust. We've really been very pleased how much interest there has been both across the campus and in the Duke and Triangle community. We have 5 co-sponsors for tonight's events: the Intelligence Community Centers of Academic Excellence, Duke's Program in American Grand Strategy, the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, Duke Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security, and Paulus, the Center for Political Leadership, Innovation, and Service. We thank them all for their support and colleagueship. And before I go any further, I want to especially thank all our staff, led by Mary Lindsley, who's walking around in the back, who have done such a great job of really making this event possible. So as many of you know, we're celebrating the legacy of Terry Sanford, the founder of the Sanford School, who would have turned 100 in this past August 2017. And such a legacy it is. As governor of North Carolina from 1961 to 1965, he focused on strengthening education, combating poverty, expanding civil rights, and building a dynamic local and regional economy. His leadership not only impacted issues in their day, but set North Carolina on a path that's benefited its people ever since. Indeed, he was later recognized as one of the 10 best governors of the 20th century. In 1969, Sanford began his 16-year tenure as president of Duke, where he was widely credited with leading Duke from a respected Southern university into a nationally prominent university. As Duke president, he founded the Institute for Policy Sciences and Public Affairs, later the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy, now the Sanford School of Public Policy. At the time of its founding, the interdisciplinary program was geared toward educating future public leaders. It was really among the first in the nation to be structured in that way. Today, the Sanford School of Public Policy supports the primary appointments of over 80 faculty and researchers, and houses one of Duke's largest undergraduate majors, 2 master's programs, a PhD program, and multiple research centers. In keeping with the spirit of Terry Sanford, the purpose of this distinguished lecture is to bring to campus, quote, men and women of the highest personal and professional stature to engage with the Duke community. We've had former heads of state, former cabinet ministers, Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, and I think it's fair to say that Terry Sanford would have agreed that Congressman Adam Schiff well fits this profile. I'm going to introduce our own very distinguished Congressman David Price to introduce his colleague, Congressman Schiff, but a word first about the format. After the introduction, Congressman Schiff will come up and we'll engage in some discussion for about 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions. And there are mics on the 2 sides, and we'll get you lined up there to pose your questions. But first, a word about Congressman Price. He was first elected representing North Carolina's 4th District in 1987. He served through 1994, was reelected in 1996, and reelected every 2 years since. Prior to that, David was a professor right here at Duke in the Political Science Department and the Terry Sanford Institute, and widely seen as one of the country's leading scholars on American politics and Congress, including having written at least 4 books. Actually, to correct myself, David is still on our faculty. He's just on an extended leave, courtesy of the people of the 4th District of North Carolina. He currently serves on the powerful House Appropriations Committee, where he's the ranking member of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee, and a member of the subcommittees covering Homeland Security, State Department, and Foreign Operations funding. Here in North Carolina, his constituents know him as a strong supporter of education, accessible health care, affordable housing, clean air and water, and improved transportation alternatives. He's also a recognized leader in foreign policy, co-chairing the House Democracy Partnership, which he helped initiate to help strengthen legislatures in emerging democracies. And he's someone as a public servant, colleague, and friend that I hold in the highest regard. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable David Price.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce, for that very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to see this turn out here today and to welcome my friend Adam Schiff to Duke and to welcome all of you to the Terry Sanford Lecture. I'm grateful to Dean Brownell and to the many people, 5 sponsors. I won't name them all, but many have contributed to this event, and so it's a coming together that I think is going to be richly rewarded. So thank you all for your part in this. This lecture is personally significant to me for a couple of reasons. As some of you know, I was a young political scientist at Yale and was recruited to help start up the Terry Sanford School. It was the Institute of Public Policy in those years. I see some other elderly founders here on the front row. There are a few of us around. It was a great assignment, recruited by Joel Fleischman, our first director, who, of course, was carrying out the wishes of his mentor, President Terry Sanford. I didn't have to be sold very hard. It was a great assignment. Helped build a program that would balance rigorous academic training for public service with policy-relevant research, with policy discourse. My particular assignment was to design an ethics course for the graduate program. And I tell you, the weight of my heart still is for some former student to say, yeah, it was a good idea to read John Rawls. That probably many of you never heard of John Rawls, but that was that was a key assignment of the course that drew a few complaints at the time. Anyway, most of us would have been. We were optimistic, but we could hardly have predicted what this program has become, what this school has become, and this event is a time to focus on that, to think about that. We're drawing on multiple disciplines. We're bringing together student, faculty, administrators, community members for a conversation on a topic that could not be more timely. I do think this fulfills the vision of the founders, and it's exactly the sort of gathering that we had in mind. The second reason this lecture is significant is because Adam Schiff is such a close friend, and I admire his work and his representation in the Congress so much. I think he's exactly the type of leader, as Bruce has said, exactly the type of leader that the school had in mind, that Terry Sanford would have had in mind, that the Keenan Charitable Trust had in mind when it endowed this lecture series. A public figure, as they said at the time, of the highest personal and professional stature. And well suited. Adam is well suited to follow in the footsteps of those distinguished predecessors. Many of you are now familiar. You can hardly avoid being familiar with the role Adam is playing as the top Democratic member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which, of course, is currently investigating Russia's intervention in the 2016 presidential election. Our democracy is under challenge. Certainly never in my lifetime have I felt that as acutely as I do now. A hostile foreign power clearly meddled in our electoral system. We have a president who refuses to condemn this meddling, also calls attempts to get to the bottom of it a hoax. And we have serious and highly sensitive questions that are still only partially resolved about potential collusion and other criminal activity. So getting to the bottom of this is about as important as it gets. It's important, especially given the challenging political environment in which we're operating. I do believe Adam Schiff has proven himself to be the right man for this job. As you will observe in how he handles himself, he balances a prosecutor's respect for the integrity of the investigative process with the tenacity to follow the facts wherever they lead, and the ability to articulate, to make clear what is at stake to the American people. That is a fortunate combination of traits. Now, this isn't a total surprise to those of us who've known Adam for all these years. He was first elected in 2000 to what at first was a very competitive district in Los Angeles County. His colleagues have long known him as a thoughtful, results-oriented legislator who puts the good of his constituents and his country ahead of any partisan or ideological interest. In addition to his intelligence oversight role, Adam's been a leader on a range of other national security and foreign policy issues. He's therefore well qualified to address the topic of the evening, challenges to our national security and democracy. He's the foremost advocate in Congress for replacing the outdated authorization for the use of military force that was enacted after September 11th. It needs to be a new framework for counterterrorism operations. As a former federal prosecutor, Adam has been an advocate for the needs of law enforcement and the independence of the federal judiciary and the Justice Department. And he brings to that aspect of his career a distinguished legal pedigree, a graduate of the Harvard Law School, and before that, Stanford University. As far as I'm concerned, it's equally important that Adam was an original member of our House Democracy Partnership, the bipartisan commission that works to strengthen legislatures in emerging democracies around the world. Adam participated in a number of our key early missions, including a key visit to Afghanistan and Pakistan that laid the groundwork for our work there. Beyond foreign policy and national security, Adam's been a leader on economic development issues, especially related to protecting intellectual property. Earlier today, we had the opportunity to convene a roundtable of business and economic development leaders from our Triangle region, and that was a very, very good session, and enabled us to engage Adam in a wide-ranging discussion about our economic future. Adam's a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, currently on leave, but we look forward to his return one of these days to that role as well. So there are many, many reasons. For all these reasons and more, I'm very, very happy to welcome my friend and colleague Adam Schiff to deliver the 2017 Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture. So let's give him a good Duke welcome. Thank you.
David, thank you so much.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And David, I just have to say, when I was a law student, you'll be happy to know that I wrote a law journal article about John Rawls, which I'm sure no one will ever read or cite for any purpose whatsoever, that hypothesized you could place a veil of ignorance over the country, not that we need it particularly, and then the states would divine principles of federalism, not knowing what resources they had, what their population was like. It was a quintessential law journal article that will be of no pertinence to anyone, but I enjoyed writing.
You're in good company here. So folks should know what a wonderful day that Congressman Schiff has given. He's had a number of meetings with our students, some of our graduate military fellows. As Congressman Price said, he really has worked hard and contributed a lot to the overall community, and tonight gives us another opportunity. So I thought about what question to start with. It wasn't really a hard decision, right? You've been in the media today a lot with this indictment from Special Counsel Mueller. Could you talk a little bit about what the indictment's about and what it isn't? Because it's been swirling around the media, and I think people know it's there but may not have a good understanding of it.
Sure. Two developments today. The first was the indictment to Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. Manafort, as you know, was the campaign manager for a period of time of the Trump campaign. And the indictment alleges a fairly broad scheme, conspiracy to launder money, to fail to report work that was done as effectively a lobbyist or representative of a foreign government. What's significant to me in terms of the investigation, because a lot of those allegations had been in the public domain, is the work that Manafort was doing in Ukraine was on behalf of a pro-Russian interest in Ukraine. Some of that work involved an oligarch named Oleg Deripaska. And it has been reported in the Washington Post previously that Manafort made outreach to Deripaska at the time he was with the Trump campaign, offering information about the campaign he was running to the Russians in the hope of getting more of the kind of money he has now been indicted for laundering. So there is a connection between the money laundering allegations, which the president would belittle as taking place before the campaign and activity during the campaign. During the campaign, of course, you have the meeting at Trump Tower between Manafort and the president's son and son-in-law with representatives from Russia who are offering dirt on Hillary Clinton, and you have communication coming from Russia to the campaign. But it's also alleged you had communications coming from the campaign, from Manafort to Russia, offering information moving in that direction. If ultimately there's a resolution of this case, and part of that resolution requires the cooperation of Manafort and Gates, we may learn a lot more about what preceded those communications, what took place after those communications, what happened as a result of those communications. The other development involved someone named George Papadopolis, and he pled guilty to essentially lying to federal agents about contacts he had with the Russians. Papadopolis was a foreign policy advisor to the campaign, and the facts that are set out in this criminal information look like classic Russian tradecraft. That is, he is bumped into in Italy. And in the intelligence parlance, when you're bumped into, sometimes an agent or an asset of a foreign intelligence agency will have a coincidental meeting. And it may appear completely accidental or incidental to you. This person expressed, called the professor, a profound interest when he learned that Papadopoulos had a role in the Trump campaign. That resulted in further meetings with other Russian emissaries in London. And the campaign was informed through Papadopoulos that the Russians had possession of thousands of Hillary Clinton emails, basically dirt on Hillary Clinton. And this was April of last year, and that's very significant because that's very early. That's before the public is aware that the Russians hacked these democratic institutions. It's before there's any public knowledge that the Russians were responsible. And it's before we knew that they would ultimately weaponize this data. It's also before that Trump Tower meeting. But it may explain why, at a pivotal time in the campaign, three of the top people in the campaign, the president's son, son-in-law, and Paul Manafort, were so eager to take that meeting in Trump Tower with the promise of information the Russians were saying was dirt on Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government effort to help the campaign. So some additional pieces today into the puzzle. And of course, we hope to get Mr. Papadopoulos' cooperation as well. Apparently, the plea agreement provides that he would cooperate with authorities. We hope that we're some of those authorities that he's required to cooperate with, because all three of them could add very important information to our investigation.
You've worked for many years and known Robert Mueller. And there's been a spate of articles recently, fire Mueller and, kind of attacking him. Can you give a sense for your impressions of him, both as a person and a public servant?
Sure. In my experience, he is a very straight shooter. He is a nonpartisan. He's also a very good, smart prosecutor. And he's assembled a very competent team, more than competent, a highly skilled team. And so I have a lot of confidence in whatever he decides. I said that before today, that if he decided to indict people, I believe it would be on a sound basis. If he decided not to indict people, I would conclude it would be on a sound basis. So I have a lot of confidence in him. I think it's enormously important that we let him do his job and that we don't get in the way of it. And of course, we need to make sure that he's not fired. And beyond being fired, we need to make sure that he is not circumscribed in what he is allowed to look at. His scope is to look at anything that arises from the investigation of the Trump campaign contacts with the Russians. So we need to let him do his job. In our investigations, we're trying to make sure that nothing we do prejudices his ability to do his work. But it's also important for people to understand that his job is different than ours. It's Bob Mueller's job to determine have U.S. laws been broken, and if so, who should be prosecuted. It's not his job to tell the country what happened. And this is very important because that's our job in Congress. That's what we ought to produce as a part of our investigation. We ought to lay out the length and breadth of what happened. This is what the Russians did. This is how they did it. These are the connections to the campaign we've been able to establish. These are the connections to the campaign we have not been able to establish. Here's what we need to do to protect ourselves going forward. So that's very important work, and so is Bob Mueller's, but it's not the same work. And it's very important, I think, that we be allowed to finish our job. We are coming under pressure from the president and his allies to try to curtail our investigation before we're finished. I think as a part of laying the predicate for shutting down Bob Mueller. And I think both of those initiatives need to be resisted. It will be of little service to the public if we make a report on what happened that's incomplete, because we were not allowed to finish our work. And likewise, it's essential, I think, that Bob Mueller be able to finish his work.
What should people be watching in terms of next steps in this question of, will your committee continue on past the end of 2017? What are some of the things that are kind of benchmarks that people could look for amidst all this information to get a sense of how things are going and where they're going?
Well, I know it's difficult for the public to get that sense because so much of the work that we're doing in committee is in closed session. We have an open hearing this week with the technology companies that I think will be a good window into at least one of the issues we're investigating, and that is the Russian use of social media to try to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. And of equal significance, the degree to which the Russians, in the most cynical fashion, were merely trying to divide us, to turn American against American, to exploit issues that are very hot button, that arouse people's passions. So we hope to show you a representative sample during our hearing, but I've urged that we publish all of the ads, and that's what we'll end up doing. Because you need to see how cynical this effort is. On the Facebook platform, a lot of the ads were focused on division, weakening our democracy. So there are things like exploiting the death of Freddie Gray, or Black Lives Matter, or Ferguson. They're intended to stoke xenophobia or Islamophobia. There are Russian ads on the Second Amendment. You'll be very pleased to know that the Russians are very big supporters of our Second Amendment. They don't want one of their own, but they're really glad we have one. And then you'll see on Twitter, the ads are really much more pointed politically. So the Twitter advertising took the form of sponsored tweets from RT, Russia Today, Russia Television, but not just any stories that Russia Television was airing, stories they wanted us to see during our election. So there were stories on Hillary Clinton's failing health, or stories on the 4 times the Clintons were almost indicted, or stories on how Trump gets it right, the Russia stuff is a hoax. So very pointed, designed to move our electorate in a certain direction. So there will be periods of relative openness. There'll be periods where we're interviewing lots of witnesses that you're not hearing about. And similarly in the Mueller investigation, people will need to be patient. In a case of the complexity of the indictment that was just disclosed, I can say this as a former assistant U.S. attorney, it might be a year before that case goes to trial, particularly if the defendants have an incentive to draw things out, feeling that time is more on their side than on Bob Mueller's. And of course, hanging over all of this is the president's pardon power. The president pardoned Joe Arpaio, and I think part of the reason for that pardon was designed to send a message that if you have my back, I have yours. Because one key fact about the pardon of Joe Arpaio is that unlike other pardons which go through a multi-year process of review by the Justice Department, where the department considers, have they served most of their sentence? Did they make restitution? Have they shown repentance? Are there mitigating circumstances? There was no Justice Department review here. This was announced at a political rally. And the case had not even concluded. Arpaio had not yet been sentenced. And the message that sends is, if you stick with me, I will pardon you. I won't even wait until the criminal proceedings are over. So that specter also hangs over us. And the last point I'll make on that subject, and I apologize for the length of my answers, my wife always tells me, your answers are too long. And she's right. But the other aspect I want to mention in terms of the pardon power, because people have been opining that it is absolute. It's not absolute. The pardon power does not include the power to obstruct justice, if you're using the power of the pardon to obstruct justice. It also, if it were truly unbridled, would nullify vast sections of the Constitution. And one principle of constitutional interpretation is you don't interpret one section of the Constitution as mooting others. If it were truly an unrestricted authority of the President could instruct the Justice Department to do things illegally and say, if you're ever brought up by charges, I will pardon you. And that would obviously completely undermine our justice system. So there are limits. They have not been tested. I hope they won't be tested here. It's also why I think it's so important for my Republican colleagues as well as my Democratic colleagues, but in particular my Republican colleagues, to speak out now. Don't wait until a constitutional crisis. Make it known that you won't sit by and allow the pardon power to be abused, or the investigation that Bob Mueller's doing be interfered with.
You know, it's interesting as we think about Russia's role here, and you know, you go back to the end of the Cold War and sort of the triumphalism. We won, they lost. I recall some of the work I was doing in the 90s, people would disparagingly refer to Russia as no longer a great power, just like, you know, like a big gasoline station with nuclear weapons, right? And we were putting them down and forgetting that they had been very good at physics and everything in an earlier period. And now suddenly we know all this about what Russia's been doing. And we knew that they were doing it in Georgia and other places around their, you know, around their former sphere of influence. To the extent that you can answer this question without getting into things that were classified or confidential, when did you and your colleagues first get an inkling that the Russians were really very active in this kind of hacking and cyber attacks within the American political system? When did we start to feel like that something was happening out there? Was it just, say, April 2016, or were there signs before that?
Well, you know, we've certainly been aware of Russian interference in other democracies and been aware of certain activities the Russians were undertaking with respect to our own democracy. I think when we first began to see that the Russians may have been responsible for these break-ins, these virtual break-ins at the Democratic Party or John Podesta's emails, it may have appeared as if this was more of what we had seen in the past. That is, an effort to simply gather foreign intelligence. It wasn't the first time that other countries were interested in learning as much as they could about someone who might become president of the United States, in this case Hillary Clinton. And one of the issues that we're investigating is at what point did our intelligence agencies, and indeed what point did the Russians, decide that no, this wasn't going to be simply an intelligence gathering operation. This was going to be an operation that involved the weaponization of that data, the strategic use of that data, the dumping of that data. Or was that the plan all along? That is a question that we have yet to answer. But one of the things that I think is implicit in your question is, what's the bigger picture here of this power, this, as you said, this power that was disparaged as a gas station with nukes, or as President Obama once referred to it, as a regional power that doesn't make anything that people want to buy. The broader significance of this is this wasn't just about helping one candidate or hurting another. And it wasn't just about tearing our democracy apart. The Russians are after tearing down the whole idea of liberal democracy. Because what they did to us, they've been doing to others. And they've had a lot of success. And in many respects, we may have presumed that this trend we were on of increasing democratization around the world was somehow inevitable and immutable, only to find out that no, it's not. And in fact, we may be at an inflection point. For everyone in this room, we've lived in a world that was ever expanding in its freedoms. And each year, more of us lived in democratic societies around the world, and more of us had a free press, more of us had the right to practice our faith and associate with who we would. But we may now be at a point where we cannot say that will be true next year. And we have even less confidence that we can say that will be true of our kids. If you look around the world, you see a real rise of the autocrats. You see it in Hungary, you see it in Poland, you see it in the Philippines with Duterte, where they're embarked on a campaign of mass extrajudicial killing. You see it in Turkey with Erdogan. Turkey is now the leading jailer of journalists in the world. Erdogan feels comfortable not only beating people in Istanbul, but in Washington, D.C. You see it in the growth of the party of Marine Le Pen in France. You see it in the far-right representation for the first time since the 1930s in the German parliament. You see it in the Austrian elections. You see a real rise of the autocrats. And this is a time where we really need a champion of democracy and human rights in the Oval Office. But that is not what we have. And you know, I went on a wonderful congressional delegation trip with John McCain last year to Munich, one of the big national security conferences. And I love traveling with John McCain because he can invite whoever he wants to dinner and they will usually come. And so he invited Bill Gates and Bono. Not my usual dinner company. And as the evening wore on, we started to tell jokes and whatnot, and Bono told a joke about being Irish. And then he got very serious and he said, I'm very proud of Ireland, I'm very proud to be Irish. But Ireland, like most countries, is just a country. America is also an idea. And the minute he said it, I knew this is really what's at stake right now, is the very idea of our country. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be champions of that idea, so that people who are looking at us from around the world and don't see that idea represented in the White House know that it still resides in all of us. And that when this administration comes to an end, that idea will once again take flight. Because I think around the world people are really wondering whether we have lost our way. You know, we fought wars to make the world safe for democracy. It's not an investment of blood and treasure and heritage that we should walk away from. Much as some have disparaged the idea of America as an indispensable nation, we really are indispensable. There is no other country that can step into our shoes. People who are concerned about human rights around the world are not going to look to China. They're sure as heck not going to look to Russia. And they're not going to look to Europe with all of its problems. They look to us, and they're going to continue to look to us. People in Mexico that are the victims of the most horrific violence, they look to us, as do people in the Philippines, as do people in Turkey and elsewhere. There is no one that can step into our shoes at this moment in time. And that has been a very proud legacy for us, a very proud role for us that is at risk right now. And that's the bigger picture. You know, I think people minimize what this is all about. Democrats and Republicans tend to think much too narrowly about just what was Russia doing, and not even just Russia, but what's going on in the world. We need to understand this as a part of a global challenge to the very idea of liberal democracy. And if we don't understand the nature of the challenge, then we are not going to have the right response to it. And it is a response that calls for a determination on our part to continue to be the advocates for a democratic form of life.
Wonderful articulation of that. I think it's good for people to see these issues beyond the immediate Donald Trump, Russia issue. And along those lines, it's interesting, you know, as we look across the United States and Europe, really over the last year and a half, even before Donald Trump was elected president, even before the Brexit vote, you sort of saw that all, you know, Western democracies seemed to be going through, you know, the same kind of pressures. There was this sense of economic dislocation, right, related to globalization of people's minds, whether it was more about technology, they thought it was about that. And you saw that in Europe, you know, and it fed the right wing in Europe, it fed the left wing movements like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, and our own, you know, I think it fed Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and the demographic kind of overlapped in some interesting ways. You had this sense of cultural anxiety at the same time, people feeling, you know, in our country, people concerned about that we would be a majority-minority country in a couple decades. In Europe, it was not just the refugees, but the legacy. And then you had the personal fear of personal security, you know, given terrorism. And even in Denmark, that nice little social democracy, the second largest party in parliament was, you know, an anti-immigrant party. So as you think about this as a Democrat, you know, a member of the Democratic Party, and beyond our concerns about the other side, what's your sense of the kind of vision, if you will, or themes to strike with the American people who were feeling these trends? They were feeling them before Donald Trump, to help people have a sense not only why Democrats are right, but how to get to a better future?
It's a really important question. I think we need to be mindful of what the economic tumult in the 20s and 30s led to. Now, we don't have any kind of the economic dislocation that was experienced during what was for us the Great Depression, but was a global depression. But nonetheless, profound economic uncertainty and the anxiety that it produces can manifest itself in support for authoritarian regimes, in attacks on anyone who is considered the other. And so we need to be mindful, obviously, of where historically that kind of profound economic anxiety can lead. In our own country, I think you're absolutely right. We often see phenomena that start here, go to Europe, or start in Europe and come here. Brexit, I think, was not unrelated to what happened and may have gotten more virulent in the crossing of the pond. But that was, as you suggested, in significant part, a response to migration and the nature of the global economy. In this country, and I view this both from a policy point of view, but also as a Democrat in terms of what my party needs to do, I think that the profound economic challenge of our time right now is, in a world that is small and at the same time global, in which automation is replacing a lot of the jobs that our parents had, what are we offering to give people hope their lives can be better? How do we deal with this? In the last 20 or 30 years, this country has produced enormous wealth, but that wealth hasn't gone to everyone, and it hasn't gone to everywhere. Some parts of the country have done very well. Some parts of North Carolina have done very well. Other parts of this state and other parts of this country have not shared in that prosperity. Even within communities, within Los Angeles, those that have prospered greatly, and those that have not have lost ground or suffered greatly. And the technological revolution that's going on right now threatens to aggravate those trends if we don't recognize what's happening and try to prescribe a program that works. We need to essentially make sure that our economy works for everyone. And to the degree that we're able to address these global forces, that we do it in a way that's fair, that gives everybody an opportunity, that says to communities that if there are one factory town and that factory closes, they won't be left behind. They won't have to leave the homes they've lived in their whole lives. And that if people in mid-career lose their jobs because of the changing nature of the economy, that there's a way to get back in the workforce. And that government and industry will be good partners in making sure people have the skills to do it. And that we are redesigning education so that our young people coming up through schools have the skills they need to compete and win. I always think back to how Bill Clinton used to do such a fantastic job at describing where the country was at any given point in time. He would tell a story about the country that always began with, this is where we were, this is where we are today, and this is where we're headed. And you know something? That can be a really bright future. And here's how we do it. We need to be able to continue to tell that story. Now, I think neither party has given an adequate answer to that economic challenge. The president's answer is, you're going to win so much you're going to be tired of winning. If that's our only answer, I guarantee you people are not going to be tired of winning. But we owe them an explanation and an agenda as well. And I think if not, then we're going to see much greater instability, much greater turmoil, and all of the adverse consequences that we've already started to see as people look to find a scapegoat for why their life isn't turning out as they had hoped.
There's a bunch more issues I want to talk about and we want to open up, but before we do, let's switch gears a little bit. Congressman Price gave you a wonderful introduction about your career. Tell us a little bit about your family, your own, sort of personal life in that respect. But also, our students are making a lot of decisions about their futures, and maybe also a little bit how you made the decisions to go into the public sector. What was your thinking and your motivation? So give us a little bit more insight into into those aspects of your life and career.
Sure. Well, I'm married. My wife, believe it or not, is named Eve. We're Adam and Eve. She went out with me as a curiosity, and you see where that led her. We have two kids. My daughter is a sophomore at Northwestern, and my son is a freshman in high school. The last year has been a rather surreal experience for me, and I think for our whole family. I'm much more recognizable than I used to be, and therefore people come up to me and tell me exactly what they think, whether I want to know or not. And I'll tell you, it's shed real insights to me in the way that we now get our information and how balkanized it is, and how much work we have to do to overcome the divisions in our society. To give you one illustration, I stepped off the platform in New York at Penn Station, and a New Yorker comes up to me and says, "Are you Adam Schiff? I just want to shake your hand. You're my hero," which I enjoyed for about a second. Before the next New Yorker came up to me and said, "Well, you are not my hero. Why are you eavesdropping on our conversations and leaking them to the press?" And I thought, okay, I know what this person's watching, and I know what that person's watching. And it's not the same thing, because obviously there's just one of me. And that, is a microcosm, one of the big challenges we face, which has gotten bigger with the nature of how we get our information online now, where you may even live in a smaller news niche and be even less exposed to contrary points of view. The other surreal part of it is you have experiences like I did a couple months ago when the President of the United States called me sleazy Adam Schiff. And I went to pick up my son at camp, and one of the wonderful things about camp is you're deprived of your electronics. My son is, tough kid, but kind of soft on the inside, and I wasn't sure how he was going to take his president being called sleazy, or his dad being called sleazy by the President of the United States. Not something that happens to you every day. And so we picked him up. I didn't want him to hear it from somebody else, and I said, I need to tell you something that happened while you were at camp. It's not a big deal, but I thought you should know. The President of the United States called me sleazy. And he paused for a minute to think about what this meant, and then he said, "Can I call you sleazy?" To which I responded, "Only if you want me to call you Sleazy Jr." So what are you to make of this complete coarsening of our civil discourse? You who may be interested in public service or the public sector or joining the Foreign Service, what do you make of this? Why would any of you want anything to do with this? And I could just say we need you. We need you more than ever. I feel like my generation should apologize to everyone in your generation, you among the students here, for handing off a piece of work right now. I'm originally from Boston. I think growing up in Boston, sort of the Kennedy ethic of ask not what your country can do for you is in the ether. And it led me to think that public service was a noble calling and to have an interest in it. I think people who grew up under Reagan, my GOP colleagues, had the same inspiration. I think young people were similarly inspired by Barack Obama. Now what do people have to be inspired by, young people? Why would anyone want to get involved in something so crass, so ugly as our political environment right now? And I can only say because we need you more than ever. And I am encouraged, I have to say, by seeing millions of people, many of them very young, involved for the first time. It's what gives me confidence that we'll get through this, the tremendous activism. And we will get through this. And I would just suggest to you, because I know with the incredible array of things going wrong right now, that it's paralyzing to look at it all. You don't know where to begin. And so it's tempting to say, I'm not going to begin at all. It's just too much. I'm just going to stop watching the news and tune as much of this out as I can. And I would just say to you, don't try to do it all. Just decide in the next year or 2 years or however long it takes, I'm going to make a difference on the thing I care the most about. And if that's climate, if what concerns you is the fact that the United States walked away from a global agreement on climate and abdicated its leadership, then get involved in making a difference there. If it's the fact that our Justice Department, which used to fight efforts to disenfranchise minority voters, is now in the business of intervening in litigation to disenfranchise, then get involved in fighting those efforts. If you're concerned about the political process, get involved in redistricting reform. There are any number of ways to make a difference right now, and I happen to think we're all going to be held to answer for what we do right now. In public life, in private life, in corporate life, we're all going to be asked by the next generation, what did you do when our country was facing such a keen challenge? I came to Congress with Jeff Flake. I have great respect for him. I think his speech on the Senate floor is the most important one I've seen in the 17 years that I've been in Congress. And to those who would denigrate Jeff Flake and say he was going to lose anyway, let me just tell you, if Jeff Flake cared about only being reelected, he would be reelected. The reason why he is in such jeopardy politically is because during the presidential campaign, he saw someone he thought was unfit for office and was willing to say so. And over varying degrees thereafter continued to say so. But he is a smart enough politician that if all he cared about was getting reelected, from the very beginning, he would have said something quite different, or he would have simply kept his mouth shut. But he thought there was something more important. And yes, it cost him his reelection. But I know that Jeff Flake is going to look back and be very proud of his service in the Senate. And I think there are a great many members of Congress who are not going to be able to look back with pride on their service in Congress, because at a time when the country needed them to speak out and put country over party, they were not willing to do so. So this is true of those of us in public office, but it's also true, I think, for all of us. Each of us needs to find and decide for ourselves, here's how I can make a difference.
Great. You know, we have an expression, Duke, about knowledge and service to society, and what you're saying both reinforces and resonates with that. But I'm sure you get the Adam and Eve quite a bit. And I have to say, it reminds me, I used to work for a number of years for Al Gore, and one of the businesses he set up in his post-vice presidential years was a financial business, and his partner, and they set up first in London, was named David Blood. And the Financial Times did Blood and Gore. Adam and Eve is much better than that. That's right, that's it. Let me just get one more question, then we're going to open it up. So you may want to start going to the microphones on the sides. And that is, as you talk about the important things that Congress deals with, clearly one of the most important things, if not the most important, is when we ask our young men and women to go to war, or to fight even battles that aren't declared. We have a lot of military veterans here tonight and part of our student body. This question of the authorization for the use of military force, which can get very technical, you know, essentially we've been fighting two longest wars in American history. We find out in Niger and Mali and elsewhere we've got troops in a lot of places. And some people blame different presidents for not coming to Congress, and a lot of people say Congress has, you know, kind of kicked the can down the road. You know, what do you think? I know you're working on this in Congress, and Congressman Price mentioned it. How should we resolve this fundamental constitutional balance on the issues of the use of force and war powers?
Well, I think that there's certainly a shared responsibility between both parties about the lack of our living up to our constitutional responsibility. Congress is the branch that is constitutionally entrusted with the power to declare war or to not declare war. We passed two authorizations back in 2001 and 2002 that authorized the use of force in a way that bears no resemblance to how we're using force today. It was authorized in 2001 that we could use force against those responsible for 9/11. Well, ISIS didn't even exist at the time of 9/11, and in fact, ISIS has often been at war itself with al-Qaeda. Why are we still operating on these old authorities, and what does it mean in terms of any check on the executive's ability to make war? The reason why we continue to operate under these authorities is during the last administration, while the president believed we would be better off repealing those authorities and replacing them with a new authority, in my view, it wasn't a sufficiently high priority for the administration to use the political muscle necessary to get it done. Now, in fairness to the Obama administration, I think they also felt that why should the administration care more about the Congress's institutional prerogative than the Congress? If the Congress didn't care enough about this to take it up and fight for it, why should the President of the United States, particularly when what Congress might do might tie the hands of the President of the United States? The other dereliction of duty was, and the bigger dereliction was on the part of Congress. Congress, repeated Congresses, that simply did not want to have to vote on this, because a vote to make war can often boomerang back against you, as indeed the Iraq War vote did years earlier. So there's a combined responsibility here. So how do we move beyond this? One of the other reasons we haven't done it is it's difficult. Both parties have red lines, and their red lines intersect with each other. And on the Republican side of the aisle, the red line is they don't want to put time limits on the authority, they don't want to put geographic limits on the authority, and they don't want to limit the Commander-in-Chief's ability to deploy troops, even in combat missions. On the Democratic side of the aisle, the red line is Democrats don't want to give the Commander-in-Chief, any Commander-in-Chief, a blank check when it comes to making war. So how do you reconcile those two things? What I've drafted, which is one approach, is a resolution that would have a time limit so that we don't have a situation again where a resolution lives on for a decade and a half. It does not, however, put limits on geography, and it doesn't put limits on the introduction of ground troops. Now, how could that be palatable? The reason it might be palatable to both parties is because I have included a mechanism where if a president does introduce ground troops in a combat mission anywhere in the world, it would trigger a privilege resolution such that any member of Congress could force a vote to repeal the authority, to modify the authority, or to ratify the authority. So there would be a mechanism that demanded congressional accountability. Now, the pundit class on the right and the left like this idea, but they don't have to vote on it. So we still have work to do to get the Congress to take it up. At the end of the day, it's the Speaker's decision in the House of Representatives. This could be taken up at any time. And if it isn't, you have to say the buck stops with the party that won't allow a vote on it. In the Senate, there has been, I think, more interest in trying to advance an authorization. So we may see the Senate take up one and force the House to act. But I consider this one of our greatest abdications of responsibility.
Right. So we're going to start the questions. And I'm just going to ask that they be questions, not necessarily long speeches or position papers. And I know, Catherine, you'll get us off to the right start.
So, Adam, I heard you on NPR, and I was really grateful to hear somebody who was analytically very clear and also conveying in the gravel of your voice that this is a time of consequence that we're in. I teach here, and I'm very interested in helping my students be able to rise to the occasion and to find within them the wherewithal to be people who rise to the occasion. So I'm wondering if you could reflect back in a personal way on your own formation, your formation during college and law school. And the particular question is, what did you learn and how did you learn it in college and law school that has made you able to step up right now?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'm glad to hear that I was clear on NPR this morning, because those interviews are like at 6 a.m., and half the time I have no idea what I'm saying. And it may sound completely different later in the day. I thought, well, I would say a couple things. In college, I was pre-med, and I was a poli-sci major, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. But that worked out perfectly, because I took a broad array of classes that were just interesting to me, and it gave me a very well-rounded education. And frankly, it has served me very well. I represent Caltech in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I love the work they do. I'm kind of a space science buff. My most memorable class in college was modern physics. And whenever I interact with my colleagues and friends from JPL and Caltech, I view it as part of my lifelong PhD. I ask them about dark matter and dark energy. I ask them about these discoveries that now confirm what Einstein thought about in terms of gravitational waves. It's totally fascinating. So I think a broad education helped a lot. In law school, I think the most important thing I learned wasn't anything about the law in particular, but it was a way of analyzing issues, which is very helpful. And on the Intelligence Committee, a lot of what we do is obviously oversee the agencies, but we have to balance the privacy interests of the public along with the national security needs of the country. And I think when we look for solutions, and right now we're looking at something called the 702 program, which is a very important surveillance program that is targeting foreigners overseas that we can gather foreign intelligence or information to protect the country. When I look at the issues surrounding that and what reforms should we make and how do we protect privacy interests, I find it very useful to turn back to what I learned in law school. What are the legitimate expectations of privacy that people have? What is the concern that's motivating the call for reform? And how do we address that concern without interfering with the operational effectiveness of the program? Is there a way to do both? And it's really helpful just to be able to analyze issues in that way that law school teaches you. The other thing I learned in law school that frankly is very helpful in the legislative process is you go into the court, you fight it out with the other side, and when the case is over, you leave it in the courtroom. And you go out for a beer with opposing counsel, and it's professional, it's not personal. I've had fights in Congress over issues I cared very deeply about, and I've always done my best not to make it personal, because someone who's my strongest opponent on an issue one day is my strongest ally the next. But if I burn that relationship, then no matter whether they agree with me or not, they're going to fight me the next time around. I clerked for a wonderful federal judge who was kind of my role model politically because I didn't have a political mentor in that way. And he always used to say, the street in front of the courthouse runs in both directions. You might be going down it one day, but you might need to come down it the other way the next day. Now this was ironic because in fact the street in front of the courthouse was a one-way street. But the idea was still good. And I think those lessons have served me well.
Let me come over here.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Mikhail Grigorian. I used to be your constituent. Mr. Schiff, thank you for all the good work you're doing for Armenian Americans and for everyone. You have touched today on important issues like democracy and freedom of speech. I went to Sanford School of Public Policy. I specialized in cyber warfare, cybersecurity policy in context of international development policy. What I've encountered is that we do have issues closer to home. So Russia definitely meddled with our elections, and I'm sure we have very capable intelligence agencies who will sort it out. But there's an old Armenian saying, we say, further you look, closer you will find. When I was a student here, Turkish organizations scheduled several events on campus, Duke campus, to deny the Armenian genocide. I'm actually a grandson of genocide survivors. Over 70 people were killed in my own family. We have tried to raise it with Duke administration, who have effectively ignored former President Richard Broadhead, Larry Moneta.
Could you put sharpen it as a question so we can get an answer and move to other people?
Yeah. And so you're a very intelligent individual, and I've volunteered for you since 2000 in framework of ANCA. But I was curious, can you please give us some advice as to, in this divisive environment in the United States, as Americans, how do we keep out the hate speech, even in places such liberal, supposedly liberal places like Duke University campus? Why is it that genocide deniers, like Turkish organizations, could hide behind First Amendment and organize such hateful and insulting events on campus? But when I stood up to ask a question in spring of 2015, Duke security very quickly escorted me out and threatened to file charges against me for trespassing.
Can we give
I
the
paid the same
Congressman
tuition in this college
Can we
as
give the
anybody
Congressman
else.
a chance to answer, please, and then move on?
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, Armenian voices are often silenced here. In California, it's fine. Boston was great. I ended up going to Harvard afterwards. It's wonderful. But Mr. Schiff, just to let you know, North Carolina is getting very strange, especially after the most recent elections. So thank you for your insights.
Well, let me begin by making a bridge between these two last questions, because one of the examples I would give of understanding that policy differences don't have to become personal differences. Years ago, I offered a resolution on the Armenian genocide, and I've actually offered it each session I've been in Congress. And it came up in the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the first time it came up in the Foreign Affairs Committee, that resolution was opposed by the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member. And it went nowhere, didn't pass out of committee. And as strongly as I felt about the genocide issue, and I feel very strongly about it, you know, I feel when people deny the genocide, I draw back on my own experience and recognize how it feels when people deny the Holocaust. But notwithstanding how intensely I feel about that issue, I didn't attack the chairman and I didn't attack the ranking member. I worked on them to change their minds. And a couple years later, we had the bill up again. And this time, the ranking Democrat moved passage of the bill, and the chairman voted in favor of the bill. And that would have never happened if I had attacked them and gone after them and their person. So, you know, I think in public office, as well as in private life, we need to show respect to people. With respect to the debates going on within college campuses all around the country right now, there isn't going to be a single answer or a single bright line to be painted here. And a lot of colleges are grappling with this. How much or at what point does free speech become hate speech? And where do you draw the line? Do you deny access to campus of people with controversial views? Does it depend on what kind of controversial view it is? And so I don't know that I can say this is the rule, the clear rule that ought to apply in every circumstance. And I imagine that this is not a problem that's going to go away, but one that I think we all have to, on the one hand, be respectful of our free speech rights, and at the same time not hesitate to condemn the denial of genocide or the denial of Holocaust, or views that are repugnant and bigoted. You know, one of the grave concerns that I have at the moment, among many, is the degree to which there is a certain normalization of bigotry going on. And that voices that were never expressed before because they would have been shunned aren't being shunned. And in other respects are being modeled by people in high office. And we can never allow that to become normal. It's not a trend that is isolated to us, and it didn't begin with this president. It is, I think, rather a product of the forces we were talking about earlier that we see manifest in other parts of the world as well, but we are not immune from it. And so, you know, I think, I don't know the particular circumstances that you're referring to, but I would say let people speak, unless what they're trying to do is incite violence or racial hatred. And I guess that's as clear as the line I could draw.
Thanks for the question. Charlie.
Congressman Charlie Dunlap from Over the Law School. Thank you very much for the pitch for practice of law. Really appreciate that because I think it's true. Let me be devil's advocate a little bit. Last March, when she was being interviewed by Jake Tapper on CNN, Hillary Clinton said that she had been contacted by foreign leaders. And then Jake kind of pressed her, but she refused to disclose who they were. just not so much on her. Should we look at all foreign countries who are trying to influence our elections? And then the other side of it is that you mentioned, we have this issue with social media now. Should we, what do you think the answer to that is? Because it does seem that the Russians bought ads on Facebook, $100,000 worth. But, Clinton spent $400 million more than Trump did. So, and I know what people think about that, but how do you want the social media companies to handle that challenge?
First of all, I would say on the question of is it appropriate for candidates for president or political campaigns to have some contact with foreign leaders during a campaign? I would say a lot depends on what foreign leaders we're talking about. Are they friend or are they foe? And what's the nature of those contacts? If the British ambassador wants to meet with a national security advisor for the campaigns, that's one thing. If the Russian ambassador wants to meet with the campaigns, and it's part of a concerted effort by his government to either gain intelligence or impact the election, that's quite another.
I should have clarified.
Yeah.
She said that they contacted her wanting to help her, quote, stop Trump. But I agree with you. There's always going to be contact with foreign leaders on a campaign generally.
Well, if a foreign government is offering to help a presidential campaign, that needs to be rejected. And I would think that if you have a situation as we saw so graphically at Trump Tower, where you're approached with information about your opponent as part of what's described a foreign government effort to help your campaign, it ought to be reported to the FBI. Now, I have no doubt that people all over the world were expressing concerns to the Clinton campaign about what Donald Trump was saying, about the fact that he was encouraging Brexit and a breakup of Europe and didn't understand the danger posed by Russia. But the circumstances here were quite unique in that a nation state, under the instructions of its head of state, was bent on interfering in the election in a way to affect the outcome. Now, your second question goes to, I think, did it affect the outcome? Is the social media spending that the Russians did compared to the spending of the campaigns really a drop in the bucket? Is it significant? And I would say a couple things. First of all, the advertising is only a small increment of the Russian social media presence during the campaign. It may be the least significant when compared to what we would call the organic content. That is, what were they pushing out on social media, not through paid advertising. So the Russians were doing things like establishing fake pages. One of the pages was called Heart of Texas, and it had a very Texas-sounding motif to it. Don't mess with Texas. It was very anti-Mexican. It was very anti-Hillary. At times it sought to potentially organize rallies for one or protest against the other. It had more followers than the Texas Republican Party. That's significant. There were other pages as well that sought to exploit other divisions or organize other efforts. And then there were efforts to amplify content. So you had negative stories about Hillary Clinton, and let's say they were accurate negative stories, but the Russians sought to amplify them so that you would see them, as opposed to stories that might have been derogatory of Donald Trump. And this is what we're looking into, but they may have tried to establish trends on Twitter, or take trends that already existed, or create hashtags that would get picked up. It's very difficult to measure the cumulative impact of that. But an election decided by only 70,000 votes, you cannot write it off. And of course, the social media component was only one component. Perhaps the greater, although it's difficult to say, a piece of this is the fact that the Russians hacked emails of one of the campaigns and began a daily dumping of that information. Now, whether that was important, whether that was an important issue in the campaign, I can tell you one person thought it was very important, and that was Donald Trump. Because over 140 times on the campaign trail, in practically every rally he gave after those documents started leaking, Donald Trump trumpeted them and how great WikiLeaks was. And have you seen the latest disclosures? Donald Trump felt that was one of the most important things for him to talk about on the stump. So he certainly felt it would be influential in the outcome. Now, I have to say I was deeply disturbed by something our CIA director said recently when he said that our intelligence community found that the Russian interference had no effect on the outcome of the election. That's not true. In fact, the intelligence community said exactly the opposite, in the sense that it said in its unclassified assessment that we make no determination of whether this affected the outcome. That is beyond our purview. That's not their job. They're not political scientists. And the president has always wanted to conflate two different things. He's wanted to conflate the fact that we have not seen evidence of tampering with the machines counting the votes with an effect on the outcome. They are not the same thing. It's one thing for the President of the United States to do it. It's lamentable when the President of the United States does it because it's misleading and untrue. It's more serious when the director of the CIA does it. But in a race this close, you simply cannot say, and no one will ever be able to prove conclusively, whether it was decisive or not. It doesn't matter whether it was decisive. It was intended to be influential. It's hard to escape the conclusion that Donald Trump thought it was influential. And regardless, we need a strategy to prevent this from happening in the future.
We are very short on time. I apologize. So why don't we take one question from the left and one from the right, as it were, and see if we can try to answer both of those together, and apologize for not getting to the others. Go ahead.
Hi, Congressman. I think a lot of people, and myself included, believe that one of the greatest threats to our democracy is in the apportionment of representation, especially in your chamber. A lot of the focus on that is gerrymandering, of course, which is going to be before the courts this year. But something that really terrifies me is the fact that in 3 years, we'll be counting on an administration that from day one literally has demonstrated that it can't count people to determine the representation for all the states through the census that will have lasting impacts through the year 2033. So I was wondering if you would talk me down from that, or if you might share in that, and if perhaps you can describe what the Congress can do to ensure the integrity of the 2020 census.
Get the other question, you can wrap them together.
Sure. Congressman, thank you so much for coming. My name is Matt King. I'm a senior here. And I was just wondering, what you've just described is a watershed moment in American history, a hostile foreign power interfering in our election process. Was the Obama administration's response to this adequate?
Let me try to address those two or three issues. Let me first mention something briefly on gerrymandering, because from my point of view, the single most important process reform that wouldn't require a constitutional amendment is a national redistricting reform. Most people are aware that, apart from our president, that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. They're not aware that, or as aware that Democrats in the House also won the popular vote. And have frequently won the popular vote, notwithstanding the fact that we remain in the minority. This is a result of gerrymandering. There are states where there are more Democrats than Republicans, or an equal number of both, and the delegation in Congress is 2/3 GOP and 1/3 Democratic because of gerrymandering. So, from my point of view, of all the redistricting reforms requiring all the states to do what California has done, which is put redistricting in the hands of an independent commission and not let legislators draw their own district and choose their own voters, is a very important reform. It would make the House much more responsive to the popular will if the House was truly competitive and not preordained in one majority or the other. In terms of the census, I think you're absolutely right. This is a very important process that almost no one knows anything about. But it's how we apportion resources. It's how we apportion representation. And an insidious way of attacking that is by defunding the census. And so, people like David are going to be absolutely critical in making sure that the Appropriations Committee continues to fund the census to a level where it can actually do the work of counting people. And it's going to be very important that the oversight committees do their job in making sure that those funds are actually utilized and utilized effectively. I will say this, one of the most concerning elements to me of the time we're going through is that so many of our checks and balances are being taken apart brick by brick. And I'm most conscious of this in the Russia context. And it's things like the president intervening with the Justice Department to get them to take action, lift a gag order to help investigate his vanquished rival. But it's also things like the White House personally interviewing candidates for U.S. Attorney in New York, but not in California. Why is that? It's the nomination of people to head the criminal division of the Justice Department, someone who is also, coincidentally, I'm sure, the lawyer for Alpha Bank, the Russian bank that was in communication with Trump Tower. But it is present in so many other respects as well, with other agencies, and in such numbers that you don't see it because of the weight of other events. And one way to erode this system of checks and balances is by deciding we're not going to count people who aren't going to support us. And we're going to diminish their representation. Now, you're seeing in North Carolina, from my point of view, now I'm an outsider, so you can just write this off, but you're seeing a legislature here, in my view, that didn't like the result of the gubernatorial election and is taking steps to undermine the independence of the judiciary, to withdraw powers from the executive. And we are seeing very similar steps taken at the federal level. They're all destructive, in my view, of our democracy. But I think you raise a very important point. Did the Obama administration make a mistake in its handling of the Russia issue? I think the answer is yes. And I've been very critical of the administration. Cyber warfare is the most asymmetrical of battlefields. The advantage will always be on the offensive because on the defense you have to guard every door and window, and on offense you need to find only one opening. And if you are determined enough and you're skilled enough, and the Russians are both, you will get in. If the Russians want to get into the DNC in 2020, they will. If they want to get into the RNC, they will. So what do you do about that to defend yourself? Well, you have to establish a deterrent. And I think it was a mistake when North Korea hacked one of our companies over a bad movie that we didn't respond. Because I think that sent a message that this was a free crime. We established no deterrent. You might remember there was speculation about whether we had attacked through cyber means North Korea because the lights were flickering in Pyongyang and going out. Well, the problem is the lights are always going out in Pyongyang. And if Pyongyang doesn't know that it's a response, it's not a very effective deterrent, whether it is or not. But I think the Russians watched that, as did others, and realized this administration isn't going to take strong enough action. And indeed, in real time, while the Russians were hacking our system, some of us who were privy to this information, Senator Feinstein and myself, raised this issue. We wrote a public letter to the administration in July of last year, telling them to make public information we had about what the Russians were doing. When that didn't happen, and we learned more and more, the senator and I issued our own statement of attribution. We couldn't get the Obama administration at that time to call out Russia on what it was doing, but I felt, and Senator Feinstein felt, this was not information we could keep from the American people. I didn't want to wait until after the election to say, hey, by the way, did you know the Russians were interfering? We knew it, and we didn't think you could handle the information. So ultimately, in October, the administration did make attribution. But they made it in a written statement signed by 2 agency heads that was released on the same day as the Access Hollywood tapes. And also on the same day, WikiLeaks started dumping the Podesta emails. Now, some of that timing on the part of WikiLeaks, for example, was not, in my view, coincidental. But the administration defends its actions by saying, well, it was bad luck that this didn't get more attention of the public. In my view, that's not adequate. That's not a good answer. If that got obscured by what was happening, then you talk about it again. And you make a presidential statement about it rather than issuing a piece of paper. And more than that, and this is not, in my case, a lot of 2020 hindsight, because this was what I was urging at the time. I think the administration should have begun discussions then, in real time, while this was happening, with our allies in Europe, and very publicly about sanctions we needed to levy on the Russians for what they were doing. Now, they had reasons why they didn't do these things. And their reasons were not inconsequential. They didn't want to be perceived as putting their hand on the scale. They also didn't want to risk escalation with Russia. But from my perspective, the concern that it would give a political appearance that they were interfering did not outweigh the American people's need to know. And in terms of the danger of Russian escalation, I was more concerned, in my experience, that the Russians would escalate if we didn't push back, rather than that we'd escalate if we did. The Russians seem, in my experience, only to respect strength and a strong response, and not having gotten one, they continued the dumping of emails. Now, there is something the Russians didn't do that I was deeply concerned about that we need to be worried about the next time. And that is, as far as I can tell, the documents that the Russians dumped were authentic documents. But there was nothing to prevent them from dumping forgeries among the real. And you can imagine what would have happened had the Russians dumped an email that suggested that Hillary Clinton was engaged in the illegality. And this could be done in a manner in which it would be impossible to determine the authenticity of that. You could take a real email and you could add an additional paragraph, and you could take a photo of that and you could dump that with everything else in a way that would be very difficult to disprove. And in a highly partisan election, you would never be able, as the victim of that, to show that it was a fake. And this is what we may face the next time around. And I will just conclude on this note. What do we do about all this? Are we helpless to do anything about this? If there's no cyber patch that can protect the DNC and the RNC next time, then what do we do about this? The single most important thing we can do about this is develop the national consensus that if a foreign power interferes with us again, interferes with our elections, we will all reject it, Democrats and Republicans. No matter who it benefits or who it hurts, it will be rejected. Now, we didn't have that consensus last year, but we sure as heck better have it next time. And the single biggest impediment to gaining that consensus is a President of the United States that says this is all a hoax. But somehow, and despite that, we're going to have to get our act together. I'm often struck in this job, and I'm sure David is the same way, by how much fortuity guides the affairs of the world, sometimes in the most terrible ways. And one of the terrible fortuities from my point of view of last year was that during the same time the Russians decided to throw caution to the winds and intervene in our election to a degree they never had before, you had a candidate for president willing to embrace that, willing to say publicly, hey, Russians, if you're listening, hack Hillary's emails, you'll be richly rewarded. Because I'm convinced that had it been Mitt Romney that was the nominee this cycle, or John McCain, both of them would have had the strength of character to say, Russia, butt the hell out. We don't want your help, we don't need your help, and we despise your intervention. But we didn't have that, and it was disastrous. And we need to, once again, establish what ought to be a very basic premise, and that is, we don't let foreign nations metal in our democracy. Thank you.
Well, we could. I think we could remember the House and not the Senate, so we can't filibuster. But really, on behalf of everybody at Duke University, first I want to thank Congressman Price for the idea and the help in working out this opportunity. I know there are credible demands on your time to have you with us, and I think you managed to give everyone, a serious and realistic picture of the issues we face, but also with a sense of hope and inspiration about people needing to and opportunities to make a difference. So on behalf of all of us at Duke, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.